But we're joined by our international editor, Sophie Mokoena, just to unpack a bit of this and actually have a look or get a sense of how the international community is receiving the news, because we have seen, as Floyd Shibambu would say, a tectonic shift in our politics. So these particular seminal elections have honestly ushered a new political dispensation, if you will, in South Africa now, because we have essentially now entered national coalition government that many have been speaking of, and said that now that it is here, we're never again going to see single-party dominance. Good afternoon, Sophie. Actually, good evening. It's 6 o'clock. My, how time flies. Sophie, good evening. Let's start with just the election of Thoko Didiza.
Well, the Thoko Didiza is her story is quite remarkable. You would realize that these are members of parliament who started a long time ago, being very young in the assembly. And
pardon us, Sophie, we'll just have to leave it there for now. We know we are running a very fluid day today. It's a very fluid show. Let's take you back to Parliament and just listen in.
It's because
I think it's got this thing in it.
it could be that, but sometimes what I do is I hold on.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah, when I
It pushes me back.
Yeah, you get used to it. But it is scary.
All right, as we're seeing there, voting is progressing smoothly. We just had to take a quick look if everything was still okay, then take it back to you, Sophie. You were still talking about Thoko Didiza as a leader, as well as a member of the African National Congress, who is now Speaker of Parliament, a very powerful position.
she grew in the ranks of the African National Congress. She was young when she went to Parliament, and she went on to continue to work in Parliament. And finally, she was appointed as a minister, and on many occasions, she was able to retain her position. Is agriculture and also public works. And later, when the former South African President Thabo Mbeki was recalled in 2008, you'd recall that some ministers did resign. She was amongst those who resigned at that time. And she went home and she was involved in, small projects, and therefore later focused on studies, and she obtained her master's degree. And later you'd recall that there was a time where the African National Congress wanted her to be a mayoral candidate of Tshwane,
yes.
But there was revolt within the ANC, in some section of the ANC, and we saw those terrible protests there, and that led to ANC even losing Tshwane. And later she went to Parliament. She became a person who is chairing a committee that looks after the needs of the parliamentarians. And at some point in time, she will come in and assist the Speaker when they were not available, both the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker, or they take a break. And then she became a minister again. And therefore, this is someone who grew in the ranks of the ANC, and also was very privileged to have interacted with the former president of the Republic, Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, Kgalema Motlanthe, Jacob Zuma, and now President Ramaphosa. And I think with this kind of experience and that authority, you can see when she speaks, and she's very humble. I think the ANC thought at this challenging time they needed someone with vast experience, with proper emotional intelligence, but also vast experience of politics and interaction with many people.
No, indeed. We did see a very confident Thoko Didiza. The minute she assumed and got into that seat, the first thing she told everybody was to settle down, and she instructed for there to be order. So quite confident, somebody who's a trusted or old hand. But then I want us to shift our focus to the Democratic Alliance. John Steenhuisen had his media briefing a bit earlier on how has the international community reacted to that announcement by the Democratic Alliance that they have signed that statement of intent, and indeed they are in some sort of a government of national unity.
Yes, indeed, he stole the limelight. I even saw the former South African Deputy President, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, saying that where's the ANC? Why the ANC doesn't brief us in terms of what's the latest? Because at that moment, Steenhuisen became an authority in terms of what's happening. And everybody take cue from what he was saying, because even the reaction when you look at the international media immediately after that announcement by Steenhuisen, there was huge reaction, including the international media were able to pick up that story. In other words, he was able to set the scene in terms of what's happening. And I think in terms of the interest also, it was at that moment where the globe realized, or the international community realized, that this agreement between ANC and DA is now a reality. You even saw the markets, local markets, responding to that positively, because you'd remember that during the build-up to where we are today, there was a talk that the intention or the interest from some international community members, the interest was to see the DA leading that pact that they launched before elections. And when that pact doesn't stand, they prefer that DA and ANC should be working together. And therefore, the second option is now working for them. And I think most of them are happy, particularly the developed North, those who have reservations and those who are aggrieved in terms of how South Africa has handled the issues, particularly at international level. We can look at the war in Ukraine, we can look at the current conflict in the Middle East, and I think they are a bit relieved that there will be a balance of power in terms of ensuring that they are able to be heard in relation to their concerns around the foreign policy.
And how has the reaction been on the continent? Because one assumes that many of the liberation movements on the continent would be watching the progress, or at least what we're seeing now, with keen interest, because they themselves, particularly in Namibia, they're going to elections, and we've heard, at least seen with reports, that SWAPO is also quite worried that they could see a shift where a number of these liberation movements could start to lose power.
Well, particularly the SADC region, you know that the relationship dates back to the frontline states, and therefore they would want to see a situation where a liberation organization, the ANC, is still in firm control. And the results of the elections did send shock waves to some of these countries, because the fear is that this will happen to our own countries. And therefore, as Namibia is going to elections, Mozambique is going to elections, Botswana is going to elections, they are monitoring and watching the developments. I think we have to wait and see during the inauguration how many countries from the south, from the continent, and from the southern part, that is SADC, will be present or send their delegation. Because I remember when I spoke to one analyst from London, who is a specialist in relation to international law, particularly international relations on the continent, saying that one thing that might be a problem might be other African countries who are led by the liberation organizations, almost isolating South Africa, with the fear that what's happening in South Africa will happen to their countries. But I think President Ramaphosa will have to assure them that he is still there, and the ANC is still there, and many other ANC members are still there. Whether they are in government or not in government, the relationship will continue. I think this is something that the SADC region in particular will be watching with keen interest.
But we saw with a number of others actually commending the oldest liberation movement, the African National Congress, for accepting defeat in this way, which is exemplary. Perhaps we will see it a bit more in the on the continent. But I want to take you back to the Democratic Alliance. Again, John Steenhuisen, as you say, he stole the show today. He spoke about an upcoming Lekgotla to talk about the issues around policy. That one seems to have concerned a number of people that clearly here you could find where they differ significantly, because that was always the assertion that on policy they differ and it's going to be a big problem. Could we see changes in foreign policy, and are some concerned, especially in the international community?
Currently, the outgoing government is dealing with lots of international issues. As we speak today, President Ramaphosa was supposed to be in Italy at the G7. He couldn't go because of these processes. Secondly, tomorrow in Switzerland that Ukraine Peace Summit is starting, and South Africa has been participating to try and find a solution between Ukraine and Russia. The other issue is the Middle East, and therefore people are worried that the foreign policy of South Africa will be tampered with. But when I spoke to the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC after the announcement of the results, and who is also the chair of the International Relations Subcommittee of the ANC, she said to me the issue of Ramaphosa leaving office and the issue of the foreign policy is a no-no. And even today, you had the Secretary General of the ANC, Fikile Mbalula, responding to journalists who really asked him tough questions in relation to where to from here, in relation to the support to Palestine and generally the foreign policy. Let's take a listen at what Fikile Mbalula had to say about the foreign policy, but also what the analysts are saying in terms of what we can expect on the foreign policy front. Let's take a listen.
It's going to be definitely difficult questions. I think this is where I think the idea of a national interest becomes quite important. A national interest that draws some semblance of consensus around core South African foreign policy priorities on the continent and beyond. And I think it becomes important then to canvass sort of the foreign policy framework document, discuss it in depth with the various political parties to try and find a degree of consensus around South African foreign policy.
Nothing will change. The case continues. Nothing will change. Our foreign policy, like I said, still intact as we go forward. So nothing will change in relation to what we as the ANC believe in going forward. We are not controlled by the DA. This is South Africa, a multi-party democracy. In our situation in South Africa, we've got opponents whom we define as our adversaries. And at the same time, they are hold their own. You know, the spirit of our constitution, our democracy, allows political parties to express themselves. We appreciate the support we got from the Muslim community, and at the same time, because of the work that we have done, that will continue to do to solidarize with the people of Palestine. It was not an election stance. It did not start with us. It started with Mandela. It started with Oliver Tambo. It started with Albert Lutuli. It started long time ago. It is who we are. We are not free unless others are free and they're fighting for their own freedom and their own self-determination. This is who we are. We are the African National Congress. You can't take that away from us. So when people are facing challenges elsewhere in the world, like we too faced those challenges in South Africa, and then they went to the UN and they said that apartheid must be declared a crime against humanity. We cannot, when we are free, not use that status to fight for the liberation of others. The people of Western Sahara, the people of Palestine, the embargo against the people of Cuba will become and will always be part and parcel of the ANC agenda going forward. Nothing will change with regard to that.
There you have it, the Secretary General of the ANC, Fikile Mbalula, on issues that are related to foreign policy. But I think as soon as the new president is elected, we'll see more reaction. And also the countries will be able to send their messages, knowing who to send the messages to. And the critical issues I pointed out, it will be to monitor who is going to attend the inauguration in terms of those relationships that South Africa has, in particular with the African continent, but also to see going forward how these different understanding of what South Africa must do or the role that South Africa must play on international arena would be, as they discussed, as Steenhuisen has pointed out, that they are going to have a Lekgotla to look at the policies, and therefore clearly DA is firm on the issue of they will have to discuss the policies. It can't be business as usual.
Sophie, thank you very much for that. That was SABC News editor, or rather international news editor, Sophie Mokoena.